Rain drummed against the tall windows of the Ashworth ballroom, with a persistence that matched the whispers rippling through the glittering assembly, and Lady Beatrice Ashford stood in the shadows near the potted palms, watching the spectacle of her third season unfold with the detached melancholy of one who has already accepted her fate. The candlelight flickered across silk gowns in shades of cream and rose, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her own dove-grey dress, chosen not for its ability to catch a gentleman's eye, but for its practicality and the way it allowed her to fade into the wallpaper she had come to know so intimately. She was 23 now, an age that whispered of spinsterhood in the merciless arithmetic of the marriage mart, and she had learned to find a strange comfort in her invisibility, though sometimes, in the quiet moments between waltzes, she felt the ghost of yearning stir in her chest, like a bird trapped behind glass. The orchestra played a familiar tune, something bright and optimistic that seemed designed to contradict the weather and her mood, while all around her the machinery of courtship turned with mechanical precision, young ladies blushing behind fans, gentlemen bowing with practiced grace, mothers calculating advantages with eyes sharp as merchants at market. Beatrice had observed this dance for 3 years now, had watched her contemporaries from that first season drift away one by one into engagement announcements and wedding breakfasts, leaving her behind like driftwood on a receding tide. Miss Charlotte Pemberton had just accepted Lord Hartley by the refreshment table, their happiness so radiant it seemed to warm the very air around them, and Beatrice felt the familiar tightness in her throat that she had learned to swallow down, to compress into something small and manageable that she could carry home and examine in private. She was not bitter, she told herself, merely practical. She understood the truth that her mother refused to acknowledge, that she possessed neither the beauty nor the fortune to overcome her unfortunate tendency toward bookishness and her inability to simper or flutter or pretend fascination with subjects that bored her to tears. The ton had weighed her and found her wanting, and there was a kind of peace in acceptance, in releasing the desperate hope that had made her first season so painful. Yet even as she stood there in her grey dress, half hidden by tropical foliage imported at great expense to make a London ballroom feel like paradise, even as she told herself she had made peace with a future of caring for aging parents and eventually becoming some niece or nephew's eccentric aunt, something in her heart refused to fully surrender, clinging to dreams like a drowning woman clutches driftwood, foolish and stubborn and entirely beyond her control. The shift in atmosphere was so pronounced that Beatrice felt it even before she looked up from the slim volume of poetry she had secreted behind her fan. A subtle change in the quality of the whispers, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the assembled company like wind across wheat, and when she finally raised her eyes, she saw the crowd parting near the entrance with the instinctive deference people show to danger. Sebastian Thorne, Duke of Ravencrest, stood framed in the doorway like something carved from granite and shadow, a man in his late 30s whose very presence seemed to lower the temperature of the room, despite the hundreds of candles burning in crystal chandeliers overhead. He was tall, powerfully built in a way that suggested violence barely contained beneath the civilized veneer of his evening clothes, and the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw caught the light like a brand, a mark that society had seized upon as evidence of his brutality, though Beatrice suspected no one actually knew its origin. The rumors about him were legion and contradictory, that he had killed a man in a duel over a woman, that he had earned his scar in some foreign war, and that his first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, though Beatrice was fairly certain he had never been married, that he ruled his vast estates with an iron fist and had dismissed servants for the smallest infractions. His eyes swept the ballroom with the cold assessment of a predator, taking in the silk and jewels and false smiles, with something that might have been contempt, and people actually stepped back as if his gaze alone could wound. The mothers clutched their daughters closer, the gentlemen straightened their spines in unconscious challenge or submission, and the orchestra faltered for just a moment before the conductor recovered and urged them back to tempo. Beatrice, however, felt none of this instinctive fear, perhaps because she had already been overlooked by everyone in this room who mattered, perhaps because she had reached a point where even a duke's displeasure seemed like a form of attention, or perhaps simply because she had learned long ago that the monsters in ballrooms wore kind faces and spoke in honeyed tones, while the truly dangerous men were usually the ones society had already condemned. She watched him with the same detached curiosity she might give to a painting in a gallery, noting the way he held himself with such rigid control, the tension in his broad shoulders, the muscle that jumped in his jaw, as if he were enduring some profound discomfort. It was in this moment of her frank observation that his eyes found hers across the crowded room, those grey eyes the colour of winter storms, and something flickered in their depths. Surprise, perhaps, at finding someone who did not immediately look away, who did not flinch or simper or pretend fascination with her fan. For 3 heartbeats they regarded each other, the wallflower and the wolf, and Beatrice felt an odd recognition pass between them, a kinship of the excluded, before someone brave or foolish enough approached him, and the connection broke. He turned away, and she returned to her poetry. But something had shifted in the careful architecture of her resignation, a single stone dislodged that would, in time, bring the whole structure tumbling down. The summons came 3 days later, delivered on cream-coloured cardstock that seemed to mock the Ashford household's increasingly shabby gentility, and Beatrice sat in the morning room listening to the sounds of her father pacing in his study below, the floorboards creaking with the weight of desperation that had become as familiar as the faded wallpaper and threadbare carpets. She had known for months that something was wrong, had seen it in her mother's 2 bright smiles and her father's distraction, in the way certain luxuries had quietly disappeared from their table, and the servants had been reduced one by one until only the most essential remained. But she had not understood the true depths of their crisis until her father emerged from his study that afternoon, with his cravat askew and his eyes haunted. "The Duke of Ravencrest has made an offer," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man who has bartered away something precious, and Beatrice felt her heart perform an odd stutter step, though she kept her face carefully composed. Her mother gasped, hands fluttering to her throat in that theatrical way she had, already calculating the social triumph, even as her father's expression suggested. This was no ordinary proposal born of affection or even reasonable alliance. The details emerged slowly, painfully, like splinters being extracted from a wound. Her father's investments had failed catastrophically, debts had mounted beyond anything their modest estate could support, and ruin had been stalking them like a patient predator for the better part of a year. The Duke, it seemed, had business dealings with her father's creditors and had proposed a solution that was as practical as it was coldly transactional, a marriage that would clear the debts and save the Ashford name from complete disgrace in exchange for a wife of suitable birth if not fortune. He was quite clear about the terms, her father said, unable to meet her eyes. It is to be a marriage of convenience only. He requires an heir and a hostess for his estate. There is no expectation of sentiment. Beatrice absorbed this information with the same pragmatic calm she had cultivated through 3 seasons of disappointment, understanding with crystalline clarity that this was her purpose finally revealed, and that she had value, after all, though not in the way she had once dreamed. She thought of the Duke as she had seen him in the ballroom, that contained violence and terrible isolation, and felt something that was neither fear nor resignation, but rather a strange kinship, as if they were both pieces of furniture being arranged for maximum utility. "When?" She asked, and her mother made a small sound of protest that died when Beatrice turned to look at her with eyes that had seen too much and hoped for too little. Her father named a date 3 weeks hence, barely enough time for the banns to be read, and Beatrice nodded once, sealing her fate with the same quiet acceptance she had brought to every other disappointment in her life. The meeting itself, arranged 2 days before the wedding, took place in the Ashford drawing room, where the afternoon light was kind enough to hide the worst of the shabbiness, and when Sebastian Thorne entered the room, he seemed too large for the space, his presence overwhelming the delicate furniture and faded elegance like a wolf in a henhouse. They regarded each other across a distance of perhaps 10 feet that might as well have been an ocean, and Beatrice curtsied with mechanical precision while he bowed with the same rigid formality, and in the silence that followed, she understood that this was to be the pattern of their union, this careful choreography of duty without warmth, and this marriage that would save her family and give him his dynasty, while leaving both of them fundamentally, devastatingly, alone. The wedding took place on a grey morning when the sky seemed to press down upon the small parish church like a weight, and Beatrice stood before the altar in a gown of cream silk that had been her mother's, altered hastily to fit her slighter frame, feeling as though she were attending someone else's ceremony, watching from a great distance as the vicar's words washed over her in a tide of incomprehensible syllables. Sebastian stood beside her, rigid as carved marble, his responses delivered in that deep voice with all the warmth of winter stone, and when he placed the ring upon her finger, a heavy band of gold set with emeralds that had clearly belonged to some previous duchess. His touch was so brief and impersonal, it might have been a stranger performing a medical examination. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance, mostly her family and a few of the Duke's business associates, whose expressions suggested they found the entire proceeding as coldly transactional as it was, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Sebastian turned to her with that terrible politeness to deliver the obligatory kiss, his lips barely grazed her cheek before he stepped back as if scalded. The wedding breakfast was a silent affair, punctuated only by the clink of silver on china, and her mother's 2 bright attempts at conversation that died in the face of Sebastian's monosyllabic responses, and then they were in his carriage, a magnificent thing of black lacquer and ducal crests that seemed designed to announce his wealth and power to anyone they passed, beginning the journey north to Ravencrest. The hours passed in suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of hooves and wheels on the road, and Beatrice occupied herself by watching the landscape transform from the gentle hills around London to something wilder and more forbidding, bare trees clawing at a colourless sky, stone walls dividing fields of stubble and sheep, everything taking on the quality of a landscape from a Gothic novel she had once read, where the heroine journeyed to her doom in a remote castle. When Ravencrest itself finally came into view as dusk was falling, Beatrice felt her breath catch not in admiration, but in something closer to despair. For the manor rose from the moorland like a monument to isolation, all dark stone and narrow windows and towers that seemed designed to repel rather than welcome, surrounded by gardens that had clearly been left to their own devices for years, everything overgrown and wild, and somehow accusing. Sebastian handed her down from the carriage with the same impersonal courtesy he had shown throughout the day, and the servants assembled to meet their new mistress regarded her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity, and the housekeeper, a stern woman of perhaps 50 with grey hair, pulled back severely from a face that had forgotten how to smile, showed her to chambers that connected to the Duke's through a shared sitting room, though the door between them was firmly closed. That first dinner was served in a dining room large enough to host 50, but set only for 2 at opposite ends of a table that seemed designed to prevent conversation, and Sebastian inquired after her comfort with the distant politeness one might show to a guest staying a single night, and Beatrice assured him she was quite comfortable, though the room felt like a mausoleum and her bed like a coffin, and afterwards she wandered the corridors of her new prison, finding only locked doors and dust-covered furniture and portraits of long-dead Thorners who stared down at her with the same cold remoteness their descendant had perfected, understanding with the clarity of complete despair that she had traded one form of invisibility for another, that she had gone from being overlooked to being deliberately ignored, and that this vast house with all its wealth and grandeur was to be not a home but simply a more elegant setting for her continued loneliness. The library revealed itself to Beatrice on the 4th morning of her residence at Ravencrest, and discovered quite by accident when she took a wrong turn in the labyrinthine corridors and found herself before a set of double doors she had not noticed before, carved oak darkened by age and neglect, and when she pushed them open the hinges protested with a sound like a sigh of relief, as if the room itself had been waiting for someone to remember its existence. What lay beyond took her breath in a way the grandest ballroom never had, for here were floor-to-ceiling shelves, stretching the length of 3 walls, filled with thousands of volumes in leather bindings of burgundy and forest green and midnight blue, though many were listing sideways or stacked haphazardly, and a thick layer of dust covered everything like snow, muting the colors and filling the air with the scent of old paper and forgotten stories and time itself. Light filtered through tall windows so begrimed with dirt that it arrived in the room already defeated, casting everything in a perpetual twilight that somehow suited the melancholy beauty of the space, and Beatrice stood in the center of what had clearly once been a magnificent room and felt something stir in her chest that was neither hope nor happiness, but rather purpose, in the first sense since her arrival, that she might have some small corner of this vast prison to claim as her own. She began the next day with nothing more than a cloth and determination, starting with a single shelf in the corner farthest from the door, carefully removing each volume, wiping away the accumulated neglect of what must have been years, examining the spines with the tenderness one might show to wounded creatures, discovering treasures she had only read about in catalogues, first editions of poetry, philosophical treatises in Latin and Greek, novels both scandalous and sublime, the collected works of minds both ancient and modern. The work was solitary and methodical and strangely soothing, requiring nothing of her but patience and care, and she fell into a rhythm that carried her through the days, arriving in the library each morning after a silent breakfast taken alone in her chambers, spending hours in communion with the forgotten collection, her hands growing grey with dust, her simple morning dresses taking on the musty scent of old leather and aging paper. She did not know that Sebastian observed her from the doorway on the third day of her efforts, standing in shadow watching as she climbed a ladder with her skirts gathered carefully to reach a high shelf, her face showing a concentration and contentment he had not seen in her before, something soft around her eyes that made her look younger and less resigned, and he retreated without announcing himself, troubled by the tightness in his chest at the sight of her finding peace in this room that had been his own sanctuary before his father's death had made duty consume everything. The books began arriving a week later, delivered without explanation or note. New volumes on architecture and botany and the Gothic novels she had noticed were missing from the collection, and Beatrice understood with a clarity that made her hands still on the spine of a volume of Coleridge that her husband had been paying attention after all, that somewhere behind that cold facade was a mind that noticed what brought her comfort and sought, however awkwardly, to provide it. She did not thank him, for that would require acknowledging the gift and breaking the careful distance they maintained, but she began leaving the library door open, and sometimes in the late afternoon she would sense, rather than see his presence in the corridor beyond, a shadow that paused but never entered, and something unspoken began to build between them in that threshold space, not warmth precisely, but awareness, a recognition that they were both perhaps less alone than they had been. And outside the windows autumn arrived properly at last, painting the wild gardens in shades of amber and crimson and gold, the season of transformation, beginning its slow and inexorable work on the cold house and its even colder master, and the lonely young woman who was learning that even in neglect there could be beauty, and in solitude there might still be the possibility of being seen. The portrait hung in what had once been a morning room on the eastern side of the house, a chamber Beatrice discovered only because she had been following a shaft of autumn sunlight that had found its way through the grimy windows, seeking any corner of Ravencrest that might offer warmth against the perpetual chill that seemed to inhabit the very stones of the place. The painting depicted a woman of perhaps 30 with dark hair dressed in the fashion of 3 decades past, but it was her eyes that arrested Beatrice's attention, eyes of such startling warmth and intelligence that they seemed almost alive in the dust-moted gloom, and there was something in the curve of her mouth, a gentleness mixed with sadness, that made Beatrice's chest tighten with recognition, though she could not say why. She was still standing before the portrait when she heard the shuffle of footsteps and turned to find Mrs. Daventry, the elderly housekeeper who had served the family for 40 years, regarding her with an expression that might have been approval or simply less disapproval than usual. "The late Duchess," the older woman said without preamble, her voice carrying the roughness of the Yorkshire moors, and something in her tone suggested this was a story she had been waiting to tell, needing only an audience who might listen with compassion rather than mere curiosity. The tale emerged in fragments as Beatrice listened with growing horror and understanding, learning that Sebastian's mother had died when he was but 7 years old, thrown from a horse on these very grounds while his father watched, and that the old duke had been so consumed by grief it had curdled into something bitter and cruel, transforming a man who had once been merely stern into a tyrant who could not bear the sight of his son, because the boy had inherited his mother's eyes and gentle disposition. And so Sebastian had been raised in isolation, taught that softness was weakness and affection a liability, beaten for tears and punished for any display of the tenderness that came naturally to him until he learned to bury it so deep that even he had forgotten it existed. "He were a sweet child once, Mrs. Daventry said, her gnarled hands twisting in her apron, always bringing me wildflowers from the moors, always asking after the kitchen cat and her kittens, but his father could not abide it, could not see anything but her ghost in the boy's face, and so he set about making certain the Duke of Ravencrest would be hard as the stone of this house, cold as the winters that blow across these hills. Beatrice felt something shift in her understanding as she looked again at the portrait, seeing now not just a beautiful woman, but the source of Sebastian's carefully constructed armor, the reason behind walls built so high and thick that no feeling could escape or enter, and she thought of the man who delivered books without comment, who watched from doorways but never entered, who had married her not out of desire for her fortune, which her family barely possessed, but perhaps out of some deeper isolation he could not name or acknowledge. When she encountered him that evening at dinner, she found herself studying him with new eyes, noting the way his shoulders carried themselves as if expecting a blow, the manner in which his hands remained always controlled and purposeful, as though spontaneity itself were dangerous. And when he asked after her day with that same distant courtesy, she responded with a gentleness she had not employed before, and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps or confusion, and she saw him almost smile, the corners of his mouth twitching upward for the briefest moment before discipline reasserted itself. But it was enough, that almost smile, and to confirm what she had begun to suspect, that beneath the ice there remained embers of warmth, waiting for permission to kindle into flame again. The weeks that followed moved like water, finding new channels through ancient stone, gradual and inexorable and transforming everything they touched, beginning with the dinners that had been such exercises in formal silence, and evolving into something neither of them had anticipated or quite knew how to name. Sebastian began arriving to the dining room earlier, no longer timing his entrance to minimize conversation, and Beatrice found herself lingering over courses she might once have rushed through. And though at first their exchanges remained confined to weather and estate business, there was a quality to the silences between words that had changed, no longer weighted with discomfort, but rather with attention, each of them listening not just to what was said, but to what lay beneath. The library became a space they shared rather than one she inhabited alone, for Sebastian began appearing in the late afternoons when the autumn light slanted golden through the cleaned windows, and at first he would simply sit in the leather chair by the fire with papers or correspondence. But gradually he began asking what she was reading, and she would tell him, and he would offer observations that revealed a mind as well furnished as any library, sharp and occasionally surprising in its humor, and Beatrice discovered that beneath his controlled exterior lay a wit as dry as August grass that could make her laugh in a way she had forgotten she was capable of, a sound that seemed to startle him each time as though he had discovered something rare and previously thought extinct. Their conversations began to venture beyond books into territory more personal and more dangerous, tentative explorations like fingers testing the temperature of water, and she learned that he read philosophy in the original Greek, that he had opinions about crop rotation and tenant welfare that were surprisingly progressive, that he noticed details about the world around him with an acuity that suggested years of careful observation from behind his walls, and he in turn seemed fascinated by her forthright manner of speaking, the way she would offer opinions without the simpering qualification expected of ladies, her refusal to pretend ignorance about subjects she had studied simply because it might be considered unbecoming. One afternoon, when they were discussing improvements to the tenant cottages, he asked her opinion on the matter, as though it genuinely mattered to him, and when she provided her thoughts on proper drainage and the necessity of larger windows for the health of the families, he did not dismiss them, but rather made notes and implemented her suggestions, and she felt something warm unfurl in her chest at this evidence that her words carried weight in his world, that she was not merely decorative but valued. The physical awareness between them grew like frost forming on a window, beautiful and intricate and impossible to ignore, manifesting in the way his eyes would follow her movements across a room, the manner in which her breath would catch when he passed close enough for her to smell sandalwood and leather, the charged moment when their fingers brushed, reaching for the same book, and both withdrew as though burned, and she began to notice details about him that had nothing to do with his fearsome reputation and everything to do with the man beneath it. The way his hair curled slightly at his collar when it grew too long, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she wanted quite desperately to trace with her fingertip, the elegant strength in his hands that made her imagine them touching her in ways she barely dared contemplate. He asked her to walk the grounds with him one morning, ostensibly to discuss the formal gardens, and as they moved through paths overgrown with neglect, she found herself speaking more freely than she ever had, and he listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced, not performing or pretending, but simply present. And when she made an observation about the estate's potential, he looked at her with something in his eyes that made her heart stumble over its rhythm, something that might have been wonder or perhaps recognition, and she understood with sudden clarity that they were both changing, that the people they had been when they married were being replaced by new versions, shaped by proximity and patience, and the slow erosion of walls neither had believed could be breached, and autumn deepened around them with its riot of dying beauty, and neither of them spoke of what was happening between them, because to name it might shatter its fragile construction, but it was there nonetheless, growing like something wild and necessary in the spaces between their carefully chosen words. The rain arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, not the gentle mist that so often shrouded the moors, but a proper downpour that lashed against the windows with a fury that seemed personal, trapping them both inside the library, where Beatrice had been attempting to catalogue a collection of medieval manuscripts, and Sebastian had ostensibly come to review correspondence, but had instead been watching her work with an attention that made her fingers clumsy on the delicate pages. They had been circling each other for weeks now in a dance neither quite knew the steps to, and the weather seemed determined to force what politeness and fear had thus far prevented, and when a particularly violent crack of thunder made Beatrice start and nearly drop a volume bound in cracked leather, Sebastian crossed the room without thinking and steadied her elbow, and the touch sent something electric through them both that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the one building between them. He did not immediately withdraw his hand as he might have done weeks before, and she did not step away, and in that charged moment, something unspoken passed between them that made retreat impossible, and when he suggested they sit by the fire rather than risk damage to the precious books, she agreed, and they found themselves in chairs drawn closer than strictly necessary, the rain providing a curtain of sound that made the rest of the world seem very far away, and this room, the only reality that mattered. The conversation began safely enough, discussion of the manuscripts and their probable age, but somehow it shifted. The way conversations between them had begun to shift, moving from the intellectual to the personal, as naturally as water finding its level, and Beatrice found herself speaking of her 3 failed seasons with a candor she had never employed before, describing not the humiliation of being overlooked, which would have been too raw, but rather the peculiar loneliness of being present yet invisible, and of watching others dance and flirt and form connections, while she stood at the periphery as though separated by glass, and how she had eventually convinced herself that she preferred observation to participation, that solitude was a choice rather than an imposition, though she could admit now, to him, in this rain-wrapped sanctuary, that it had been a lie she told herself to survive the disappointment. Sebastian listened with an intensity that made her feel as though every word mattered, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking, and his voice, when it came, was rougher than she had ever heard it, stripped of its usual careful control, and he told her that he understood isolation in ways he suspected she could not imagine, that he had been alone not for 3 seasons, but for 3 decades, that his father had systematically destroyed his capacity for connection, and that he had spent his adult life perfecting the art of being untouchable because it seemed safer than risking the pain of being touched and found wanting. And as he spoke, Beatrice felt her heart crack open with understanding, and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to love, and she reached across the small distance between their chairs and placed her hand over his 6 where it gripped the armrest, and he stared at their joined hands as though she had performed some incomprehensible magic. The moment stretched between them taut as a wire, and she could see him fighting himself, see the old habits of withdrawal warring with something newer and more fragile. And then abruptly he stood, breaking the contact, and she felt the loss of his warmth like a physical blow, and he crossed to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension, and she knew he was retreating behind his walls again, but when he spoke, his voice betrayed him with its tremor, and he said without turning that he had not expected her, had not expected kindness or understanding, and he did not know what to do with either. And Beatrice rose and went to stand beside him at the window, not touching but close enough to feel the heat of him, and she told him softly that he need not do anything, that she asked nothing of him, except perhaps to stop punishing himself for being human, and he turned to look at her then with such naked vulnerability in his eyes that she had to look away. And outside the rain continued its relentless percussion, and inside something had shifted irrevocably between them. A door opened that neither of them could close again, no matter how much fear might demand it, and though he retreated to his study soon after, and she to her chambers, they both knew that they had crossed some invisible boundary from which there could be no return to the careful distance of before. Winter came to Ravencrest with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the harshness of previous years, or perhaps it was simply that the house itself had changed, that the cold stone walls no longer felt quite so forbidding now that Beatrice had begun her quiet transformation of the space, starting with the entrance hall, where she instructed the servants to bring in evergreen boughs and hollyberries, their red brightness a defiant splash of color against centuries of grey austerity, and Sebastian, returning from a morning ride to find his house suddenly festooned with greenery, had stopped in the doorway with an expression Beatrice could not quite read, something between confusion and wonder, as though he had walked into the wrong residence entirely. She had worried in that moment that she had overstepped, that her changes would be unwelcome, but he had simply removed his gloves slowly, his dark eyes traveling over the transformed space, and then he had looked at her with such unguarded softness that her breath had caught, and he had said quietly that he could not remember the last time Ravencrest had been decorated for Christmas, and she had understood from the roughness in his voice that it had been before his mother died, before his father had turned their home into a mausoleum of grief and rage, and she had wanted to cross the space between them and take his hand, but had not quite dared, and instead she had simply smiled and told him that it was only the beginning, that the house deserved to remember how to celebrate, and something in his face had shifted at her words, as though she had given him permission for something he had not known he needed. The servants noticed the change in their master, with a mixture of astonishment and quiet approval, for Sebastian began spending more time in the common areas of the house rather than sequestered in his study, and he would pause to observe Beatrice's preparations with an attention that seemed to drink in every detail, watching as she directed the arrangement of candles in the windows, as she worked with the housekeeper to plan a proper Christmas dinner for the staff, as she sat by the fire in the evenings, creating small decorations from ribbon and pine cones, with a contentment on her face that transformed her from merely pretty to something luminous. And Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, remarked to the butler that she had not seen his grace smile in 20 years, but he had done so twice in the past week, and both times while watching the new Duchess, and perhaps miracles were not quite as rare as the church would have them believe. It happened on a snowy afternoon 3 days before Christmas, when Beatrice was attempting to hang a kissing bough in the doorway between the drawing-room and the library, and found herself standing precariously on a chair that wobbled with each movement. And Sebastian had entered to find her thus engaged, and had crossed the room in 3 swift strides, his hands coming to her waist to steady her, and she had gasped at the contact, at the heat of his palms burning through the layers of her dress, and she had looked down to find him staring up at her with such intensity that the kissing bough had nearly fallen from her nerveless fingers, and he had lifted her down with a gentleness that belied his strength, and for a long moment they had stood there, his hands still at her waist, her palms resting on his shoulders, and she had made some foolish comment about the tradition of mistletoe to cover her breathlessness, and he had looked up at the greenery she had been attempting to hang, and then back at her with something almost like mischief in his eyes, and he had said that he was aware of the tradition, and then he had laughed, actually laughed, a sound so unexpected and genuine that it had transformed his entire face, erasing years of severity and revealing the man he might have been if life had been kinder, and Beatrice had felt her heart turn over in her chest with the sudden devastating knowledge that she was in love with her husband, completely and irrevocably in love with this damaged and complicated man who was learning how to smile again because of her presence in his life, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying because she had no idea if he felt anything beyond gratitude or companionship, and she was not certain she could bear to know if he did not, and so she had stepped back and busied herself with the kissing bough to hide the emotion surely written across her face, and Sebastian had retreated as well, though his eyes had lingered on her for a long moment before he turned away. And the house continued its transformation around them, becoming warmer and brighter with each passing day, a physical manifestation of the thawing happening between two hearts that had both believed themselves beyond the reach of such ordinary magic as love. The invitation arrived on a morning in mid-January, when the ground lay frozen beneath a coverlet of pristine snow, and Beatrice was breaking her fast in the small dining room that had become their informal gathering place, Sebastian across from her reading correspondence with the focused attention he brought to all matters of business, and she had been contentedly planning her day. Perhaps another session in the library, or a walk through the winter gardens if the weather held, when he made a small sound of displeasure, and she looked up to find his jaw tight with tension as he stared at the heavy cream paper in his hand. And when she inquired gently what troubled him, he had passed the invitation across the table without comment, and she read with growing dread the elaborate script summoning the Duke and Duchess of Ravencrest to Lord and Lady Pemberton's winter ball in London, one of the most anticipated events of the little season, and she felt her stomach drop because she had known this moment would come eventually, that they could not hide at Ravencrest forever, no matter how much she might wish it, but she had hoped for more time, more certainty about what lay between them, before facing the cruel scrutiny of the society that had dismissed her so thoroughly during her 3 failed seasons. Sebastian was watching her with an intensity that made her aware he was reading far more in her expression than she intended to reveal, and she forced herself to set the invitation down with a steadiness she did not feel, and say something appropriately neutral about the honor of the invitation, though they both knew it was less honor than obligation, for a duke could not simply disappear from society without consequence, no matter how much he might prefer isolation. And he said quietly that they need not attend if it would distress her, and she heard in his voice a protectiveness that made her heart ache even as it warmed her. And she found herself assuring him that of course they must go, that it would be expected, though the thought of walking into that glittering ballroom on his arm filled her with a fear she could not quite name, for she knew what the gossips would say, what they always said, that she was plain Beatrice Ashford, who could not catch a husband in 3 seasons, and had somehow trapped the fearsome Duke of Ravencrest into a marriage of convenience, and they would whisper about his scars and his reputation, and wonder what desperate straits had driven him to such a union, and she could bear their judgment of herself, but the thought of them sneering at Sebastian made something fierce and protective rise in her chest. The weeks that followed were consumed with preparation, modistes summoned from London to create appropriate gowns, Sebastian insisting with a firmness that brooked no argument that she should have whatever she desired, regardless of cost, and she had tried to protest that her existing wardrobe was adequate, but he had looked at her with something almost like anger, and said that she was a duchess now and would be dressed as befitted her station, though she suspected his insistence had less to do with propriety and more to do with armor, as though fine clothes could somehow shield her from the cruelty he knew awaited them. And as the day of departure approached, she found herself increasingly aware of the tension building between them, the way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking, the way her skin felt too sensitive whenever he was near, the unspoken feelings that seemed to thicken the air between them until she could hardly breathe, and she caught herself wondering what would happen if she simply told him the truth, that she loved him, that the thought of facing London society terrified her less than the thought of continuing this careful dance of near intimacy without ever crossing into something real. But she was afraid, so desperately afraid, that her love would be unwelcome, that it would drive him back behind the walls he had begun to lower, and so she remained silent, even as the tension wound tighter with each passing day. And when they finally departed Ravencrest on a grey February morning, the house she had come to love receding behind them as the carriage carried them toward London and whatever judgment awaited, she felt as though they were travelling towards some inevitable crisis, a test that would either forge them together or break them apart entirely, and she did not know which outcome frightened her more. The Pemberton ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles that cast dancing shadows across walls, draped in ivory silk and gold brocade, and Beatrice stood at the entrance with Sebastian's arm beneath her gloved hand, feeling the collective attention of London society turned toward them like a physical force, a wave of whispers and stares that made her want to retreat back to the carriage and flee to Ravencrest, where they had been safe and warm, and apart from this glittering cruelty, but Sebastian's arm was steady beneath her fingers, and she drew strength from that steadiness, even as she felt him stiffen beside her. His jaw tightening in that way she had come to recognize as his armor rising, his walls rebuilding themselves against the assault of judgment he had known would come. The whispers reached them in fragments carried on the perfumed air, cruel snippets that cut like glass even though Beatrice had steeled herself for exactly this reception, and she heard "Beauty and the Beast," spoken with malicious amusement by Lady Charlotte Pemberton, who had been one of the reigning beauties during Beatrice's own failed seasons. Her desperate measures and his scars, and plain little Ashford, and what could he possibly see in her, from clusters of matrons and debutantes, who seemed to take particular pleasure in their dissection of this unlikely union, and she felt Sebastian's entire body go rigid beside her, felt him beginning to retreat into that cold, distant place he had inhabited when she first arrived at Ravencrest, and something fierce and protective rose in her chest, something that burned away her own fear and self-consciousness in the face of a greater rage, for she could bear their judgment of herself, because she had endured 3 seasons of their dismissal and survived. But she would not, could not, allow them to diminish him, this complicated man who had learned to laugh again in her presence, who had given her books and freedom and a home where she finally felt she belonged, who was so much more than the scarred monster they saw when they looked at his face. She turned slightly toward him, aware that every eye in the ballroom was upon them, and she met his gaze with a steadiness that seemed to surprise him, and then deliberately, consciously, making a choice that she knew would define everything that followed, she lifted her free hand and placed it over his where it rested stiff and formal at his side, twining her fingers through his in a gesture of unmistakable intimacy and solidarity, claiming him publicly in a way that left no room for doubt about where her loyalty resided. And she saw shock flicker across his features, saw something like wonder break through the defensive coldness, and she said quietly, but clearly enough for those nearest to hear, that she was glad they had come, and that she had missed London, but found she preferred Ravencrest now, preferred the peace and beauty of their home together, and the emphasis she placed on those last words was deliberate, a declaration that they were together in truth and not merely in legal convenience. And the whispers around them changed pitch slightly, confusion mixing with the malice, for this was not the reaction they had expected from plain Beatrice Ashford, who should have been grateful for any marriage at all. Sebastian looked down at their joined hands as though he had never seen such a thing before, and Beatrice saw his throat work as he swallowed, saw the careful control of his expression waver, and when he looked at her again, there was something raw and unguarded in his dark eyes, something that made her breath catch, because she had never seen him look at anyone with such naked emotion, and he raised their joined hands slightly as though testing whether she would pull away, and when she did not, when instead she tightened her grip and lifted her chin with a defiance that dared anyone to comment, she heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the tremor that ran through him, and she understood in that moment that her public choosing of him, her defense of him against the cruelty of a society that had always judged by surfaces, meant more to him than perhaps anything else she could have done, and the walls she had felt rising began to crumble again, and he looked at her with something like reverence, and he said her name, just her name, but it sounded like a prayer, and the ballroom and its whispers faded into irrelevance, because all that mattered was this moment, this choice, this man whose hand held hers as though she had given him something precious and fragile that he feared he might break. The orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz, and Sebastian turned to her with an expression she had never seen before, vulnerable and determined in equal measure, and he said with quiet formality that belied the emotion in his dark eyes, that he would be honored if she would grant him this dance. And Beatrice felt her heart stop, because they had never danced together, not at their wedding, which had been too small and somber for such frivolity, not in the months since at Ravencrest, where music had been absent from their careful courtship of books and quiet dinners, and she understood that this was significant, that he was offering her something profound in front of all these people who had whispered their cruelty, and she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, while the ballroom fell into a silence more pronounced than any whispers. Every eye fixed upon them as he drew her into the proper position for the dance, one hand at her waist and the other holding hers with a gentleness that made her want to weep. They began to move, and Beatrice was acutely aware of every point where their bodies nearly touched. the heat of his palm through the silk of her gown, the strength in the arm that guided her through the turns, and the way he looked down at her as though she were the only person in the vast glittering room, and she had danced this waltz 100 times during her 3 failed seasons. Always with partners who made polite conversation about the weather or complimented her gown with obvious insincerity. But dancing with Sebastian was entirely different. It was intimate, in a way that made her feel as though they were sharing something secret and precious, despite the audience that watched their every movement. He drew her slightly closer than strict propriety demanded, and she felt his breath stir the curls at her temple, and he said so quietly that only she could hear that she had defended him, stated it as though the fact still amazed him, and she looked up to find his expression unguarded in a way it had never been before. Raw with an emotion she dared not name for fear she was wrong, and she said simply that, of course, she had defended him, that she would always defend him, and the word always hung between them, weighted with meaning, a promise and a confession wrapped into one syllable, and she saw his hand tighten on her waist, saw his throat work as he swallowed, and he said her name again the way he had before, like a prayer, like she had given him something he had never expected to receive, and she felt tears prick her eyes, because she understood in that moment that he had been alone for so very long, judged by his scars and his coldness and his tragic history, and that her choosing of him, her public declaration of loyalty, had breached defenses he had spent decades building. The waltz carried them through turns and sweeps, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization as though they had danced together 1,000 times before, and Beatrice felt something shift between them, some final barrier crumbling away, and she knew with sudden crystalline certainty that this was the turning point, that whatever had been building between them since that first day at Ravencrest, when he had found her in his library, had reached some critical threshold, and when the music finally drew to a close and Sebastian released her with obvious reluctance, she saw in his eyes the same realization, the same awareness that they could not go back to the careful distance they had maintained, that something fundamental had changed in the space of one waltz, while London society watched and whispered, and as he escorted her from the floor with her hand still trembling in his, Beatrice understood that they were both terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, balanced on the precipice of something that could either save them both or shatter them entirely, and she did not know which outcome awaited them, but she knew with absolute certainty that there was no turning back now, that the truth between them would have to be spoken, and that everything would change. The carriage journey back to Ravencrest passed in a silence so charged that Beatrice felt as though the very air between them hummed with unspoken words, with the weight of everything that had shifted during that waltz when Sebastian had held her close, and she had promised always, and she sat across from him in the darkness, broken only by the swaying carriage lamp, watching the play of shadow and light across his scarred features as he stared out the window at the passing countryside, his jaw tight, and his hands clenched on his knees in a way that spoke of some internal struggle she could not decipher, and she wanted desperately to reach across the small space that separated them and take his hand the way she had in the ballroom, to tell him that she had meant what she said, that her defense of him had come from a place deeper than mere loyalty or duty, but uncertainty held her frozen because she did not know what he was thinking, did not know if the emotion she had seen in his eyes during their dance had been real, or merely a reflection of her own desperate hoping, and so she remained silent, while her heart beat an anxious rhythm against her ribs, and the miles between London and home disappeared beneath the carriage wheels. When they finally arrived at Ravencrest in the deep hours before dawn, Sebastian handed her down from the carriage with the same careful courtesy he had always shown, but his touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, his fingers warm through her glove, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she could not read, something fierce and frightened all at once, and she thought he might speak, might give voice to whatever thoughts had occupied him during their silent journey, but instead he released her hand and stepped back, and he said only that it had been a long evening and she should rest, his voice formal and distant in a way that made her chest ache, and she watched him turn and disappear into the darkened house while she stood alone in the entrance hall, feeling as though something precious had slipped through her fingers just when she thought she might finally grasp it. The days that followed were a peculiar torture, for Sebastian retreated behind walls she had thought they had dismantled together, taking his meals in his study and avoiding the library where they had spent so many companionable hours. And when they did encounter each other in the corridors or at dinner, he was polite and correct and utterly remote, and Beatrice felt the distance between them like a physical pain, like something vital had been severed, and she lay awake at night in her chamber, replaying every moment of that London ball, trying to understand what had changed, what had frightened him back into his isolation, wondering if she had imagined the tenderness in his eyes when they danced, if she had misread everything and built castles from wishes rather than truth. She tried to tell herself that he needed time, that perhaps the intensity of what had passed between them in that ballroom had overwhelmed him, that a man who had been alone as long as Sebastian had been would naturally retreat when faced with emotions he had not experienced in years, but doubt crept in with each day of his absence, each careful avoidance, each moment when he looked at her with something like longing before turning away. And she began to wonder with growing despair if she had been foolish to hope, if the connection she felt between them was one-sided, if he regretted the vulnerability he had shown her and wished to restore the safe distance of their original arrangement, and the thought that she might have to live the rest of her life in this house with a man she loved who could not or would not love her in return was almost more than she could bear, and she felt herself withdrawing as well, protecting her own heart against the ache of his rejection, and the warmth they had built together through autumn and winter began to fade like the last embers of a dying fire, and Ravencrest felt cold again, felt like the prison it had been when she first arrived, and Beatrice understood that she was losing him, or perhaps had never truly had him at all, and the realization broke something inside her that she feared might never properly heal. It was 3 days after their return from London, when Beatrice's world tilted on its axis once more, when she happened to pass by Sebastian's study on her way to the morning room, and heard voices within, in his deep rumble and another man's lighter tone. And she would have continued on her way, respecting his privacy, as she always did, except that she heard her own name spoken, and she froze in the corridor with her heart suddenly pounding, because there was something in the way the stranger said, "Your wife," that made her press closer to the partially open door, and she heard Sebastian's response, rough and weary, in a way that made her chest constrict, saying that the marriage had been a mistake, that he should never have agreed to it, and the words struck her like physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape because she had suspected this and had feared it during these long days of his withdrawal, but hearing it confirmed in his own voice was a pain she had not been prepared to endure, and she did not wait to hear more, could not bear to stand there and listen to him enumerate the reasons he regretted binding himself to her, and she fled down the corridor to her chamber, where she locked the door and stood trembling against it, while her mind replayed those terrible words over and over like a cruel refrain, and she understood now why he had retreated, why he had avoided her since that waltz when she had foolishly believed they were drawing closer. Because he had realized during that dance or in the silent carriage ride home that he did not want this marriage, he did not want her, and that all the small moments of connection they had shared had been nothing more than courtesy on his part, a gentleman making the best of an arrangement he now recognized as unbearable, and the thought that she had fallen in love with a man who regretted their very union was so humiliating, so utterly devastating, that she felt something inside her simply shut down, some part of her heart that had been tentatively opening now slamming closed in self-preservation. She decided then. Standing in her chamber with tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes, that she would make this easier for him, that she would withdraw completely and would require nothing of him beyond the basic courtesies their positions demanded, would give him the space he clearly craved, and perhaps in time she might learn to be content with the library and the gardens and the life of a duchess who existed separately from her husband. And if the thought of such an existence made her want to weep, well, she had always known she was destined for loneliness, had accepted her fate as a spinster before this marriage had offered her false hope, and she would simply return to that acceptance, would wall off her heart the way he had walled off his, and she would survive. This the way she had survived 3 seasons of rejection and whispered pity, with dignity and quiet resignation, and so when she saw Sebastian at dinner that evening, she was composed and distant, speaking only when addressed and keeping her responses brief and polite, and she saw confusion flicker across his features at her coldness, saw his brow furrow as though he wanted to ask what had changed, but she looked away and concentrated on her plate, and when the meal ended she excused herself immediately, rather than lingering as she sometimes had in recent weeks, and she felt his gaze follow her from the room, but she did not turn back, could not bear to see whatever expression he wore, whether it was relief at her withdrawal or mere puzzlement, and she spent the evening alone in her chamber, reading the same page over and over, without comprehending a single word, while her mind circled endlessly around those overheard words. The marriage had been a mistake, and she wondered how long they would have to endure this farce, how many years of careful distance stretched before them, and whether the ache in her chest would ever diminish, or if this was simply her lot now, to love a man who regretted her existence. And the irony was not lost on her that she had finally found someone who made her feel seen and valued, only to discover that it had all been illusion, that she remained as unwanted as she had always been, just in a grander house with a more impressive title, and she thought perhaps that was the cruelest joke of all. The storm arrived on the third evening of their mutual withdrawal, rolling across the countryside with the fury of nature unleashed, wind howling around the ancient stones of Ravencrest, and rain lashing against the windows, with such violence that the glass seemed to shudder in its frames, and Beatrice had retreated to the library, seeking the comfort of books, when she heard the door open and turned to find Sebastian standing there, his hair dishevelled as though he had been running his hands through it, his cravat loosened, and his expression haggard in a way that made her heart clench, despite her resolve to remain distant. And he said her name, just Beatrice, but there was such weight in it, such exhaustion, and something that sounded almost like desperation, that she felt her carefully constructed walls begin to tremble, and she turned away because she could not look at him without remembering that he regretted their marriage, could not bear to see the face of the man she loved, knowing he wished himself free of her. But he crossed the room in several long strides, and he said her name again, demanding now, asking what had happened, why she had withdrawn from him, and the question was so absurd, so utterly incomprehensible given what she had heard, that something inside her simply broke, and she whirled to face him with tears streaming down her cheeks that she had not even realized were falling, and she heard herself say in a voice raw with pain that she was making it easier for him, that she would not force him to endure a marriage he regretted, that she would require nothing from him beyond the basic courtesies their positions demanded. And she saw his face go pale, saw shock, and then something like horror cross his features, and he reached for her, but she stepped back because she could not bear his touch, could not survive his pity, and she said she had heard him tell his solicitor that their marriage was a mistake, and the composure she had maintained for 3 days shattered completely as she spoke the words aloud, and she was sobbing now, great wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, and she said she was sorry for being the unwanted wife he had been saddled with, sorry for being another burden he had to bear. And she saw his devastation, saw him standing frozen as though her tears were weapons wounding him, and then he was moving, closing the distance between them despite her attempt to retreat, and his hands came up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her weep harder, and he said, "Oh God, Beatrice, no," his voice breaking on her name, and he told her she had heard only part of that conversation, that what he had said was that agreeing to a marriage of convenience had been a mistake because he had wanted so much more, had wanted her for reasons that had nothing to do with duty or arrangement, and his thumbs were wiping away her tears even as his own eyes grew suspiciously bright, and he said he had been a fool, a coward, that he had withdrawn because he was terrified of the depth of his own feelings, terrified that she could not possibly feel the same, that he would destroy whatever fragile friendship they had built by wanting more than she could give, and the truth spilled from him in a rush of words, clumsy and honest and so utterly vulnerable that Beatrice felt her heart crack open, and she stared at him through her tears, while thunder rolled overhead and rain drummed against the windows, and she understood that they had been two fools circling each other in fear, each believing themselves unwanted, each protecting a heart that was already lost, and the realization was so overwhelming that she could not speak, could only stand there trembling in his gentle hold, while everything she thought she knew rearranged itself into a truth more beautiful and terrifying than she had dared imagine. Sebastian's hands trembled against her face as he drew a shuddering breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with an emotion so profound it seemed to strip away every layer of protection he had ever worn, And he said, "You've always been mine, Beatrice, from the very first moment I saw you." And she felt her heart stop because the words made no sense given what she knew of their arrangement, and he must have seen the confusion in her tear-stained face because he continued, his thumb still gently stroking her cheeks as though he could not bear to stop touching her, and he told her that it had been her first season when he had noticed her sitting in a corner of the Pemberton ball reading a book while everyone else danced, and he had been struck by her complete indifference to the spectacle around her, by the way she seemed to exist in her own world, untouched by the desperate gaiety of the marriage mart, and he had wanted to approach her then, but he had already known himself to be a man scarred, both physically and emotionally, a man whom young ladies whispered about in tones of horrified fascination, and he had told himself he had no right to inflict his darkness upon someone who seemed to carry her own quiet light. And so he had only watched her from across crowded ballrooms, and had noticed when she returned for a second season, looking slightly more resigned, her shoulders carrying the weight of societal judgment, and he had seen the way other gentlemen overlooked her in favor of prettier, more vivacious girls, and it had made him furious in a way he had not fully understood, this waste of someone so clearly remarkable, and by her third season he had abandoned all pretense of not seeking her out, had positioned himself where he might observe her, had learned her habits and her preferences, had discovered that she favored the library at the Ashford townhouse and took walks in the park at unfashionable hours, and he had been gathering his courage to approach her properly, to court her, despite knowing he had nothing to offer but a damaged heart and a reputation that would likely frighten her away, when he had learned of her father's financial troubles, and he confessed now with something like shame in his voice that he had seized upon it as an opportunity, had gone to Lord Ashford with an offer that appeared to be business, but was, in truth, the desperate action of a man who could not bear to let her slip away, who had watched her for 3 years and fallen impossibly in love with someone he had never even spoken to, and he said he knew it was madness, knew that arranging a marriage of convenience with a woman who did not know he existed beyond his fearsome reputation was perhaps the most selfish thing he had ever done. But he had told himself that he could make her happy, could give her the library and the books and the quiet life she seemed to prefer, could protect her from the cruelty of a society that had failed to see her worth, and if she never loved him in return, well, he would have the privilege of existing in her presence, of ensuring she never wanted for anything, of watching her bring light into his dark world, even if that light was never meant for him. And he had not anticipated how difficult it would be to maintain distance once she was actually his wife, and had not realized that every small interaction would make him want more, that seeing her gentle kindness and sharp wit and quiet strength up close would transform distant admiration into something far more consuming and terrifying, and he had withdrawn after the London ball because he had felt the walls he had built around his heart crumbling, had known that if he allowed himself to hope that she might feel even a fraction of what he felt, the devastation when he discovered otherwise would destroy him completely. And now he stood before her with his soul laid bare, trembling with the vulnerability of complete honesty, and he said, "I love you, Beatrice. I have loved you since before you knew my name, and I am sorry, so desperately sorry that my cowardice made you doubt for even a moment that you are wanted, that you are cherished, that you are the answer to every question I did not know I was asking." And Beatrice felt tears streaming down her face again, but they were different now, born not of pain but of overwhelming relief and joy, and the stunning realization that she had been seen all along, that during those 3 seasons when she had believed herself invisible, she had been noticed and valued by the one person whose regard she had come to crave above all others, and she reached up to cover his hands with her own, pressing them more firmly against her face, and she said, "I love you too, Sebastian. I think I began falling in love with you the moment you had those books delivered to the library, when you showed me through that simple gesture that you saw me, truly saw me, and I have been lost to you ever since." And the confession seemed to break something in him, and she saw a tear slip down his scarred cheek, and she realized with wonder that this fearsome man was weeping, that her words had moved him beyond the bounds of the control he usually maintained so rigidly, and the knowledge filled her with a tenderness so fierce it felt like a physical ache. The tenderness that filled Beatrice transformed seamlessly into something more urgent, as Sebastian drew her closer, his hands sliding from her face to cradle the back of her head, his fingers threading through her hair with a reverence that made her breath catch, and she rose on her toes even as he bent toward her, and when their lips finally met, it was not the chaste kiss of their wedding day, but something profound and transformative. A union that seemed to pour years of longing and denial and desperate hope into a single moment of connection, and she felt his breath shudder against her mouth as he kissed her with a hunger tempered by such exquisite gentleness that tears continued to slip down her cheeks, even as joy bloomed in her chest, and her hands came up to grip the lapels of his coat because she needed something to anchor her to earth when she felt as though she might simply dissolve into pure feeling, and he pulled back only to rest his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily, and he whispered, "My Beatrice, my love, my heart," and the possessiveness in his voice sent warmth cascading through her entire body, and she said, "Yours, always yours," and they stood there in the library, with the storm raging outside, while a different kind of storm raged between them. And when he kissed her again, it was deeper, more insistent, and she felt the careful control he had maintained for months beginning to slip away, felt the full force of his desire breaking free from the constraints he had imposed upon it, and she met him with equal fervor because she had her own months of suppressed longing to express, her own need to show him through touch what words seemed inadequate to convey, and somewhere in the haze of sensation she became aware that he was guiding her backward, that the solid surface of the library desk was behind her, and his hands were at her waist, lifting her to sit upon it, and he stepped between her knees with an intimacy that made her gasp, and he said her name like a question, like a request for permission, and she answered by pulling him closer, by kissing him with an abandon she had never imagined herself capable of, and the emotional intimacy of their confessions transformed into physical intimacy, as natural as breathing, as inevitable as the dawn that would eventually break over the storm-washed countryside. And she learned the taste of him, the feel of his scarred face beneath her trembling fingers, and the sound he made low in his throat when she touched him in ways that pleased him, and he learned her too, discovered with reverent attention what made her sigh, what made her arch into his touch, what made her whisper his name with such sweet desperation that he had to pause and simply hold her, overcome by the reality of her responsiveness, by the gift of her trust and desire, and the library that had been the site of so many tentative steps toward connection became the place where they finally, completely, irrevocably became one, and the morning found them in Sebastian's chambers, where he had carried her sometime in the dark hours before dawn, found them tangled together in sheets that bore witness to their union, and Beatrice woke to find him watching her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache, and he reached out to trace the curve of her cheek with one finger, and he said, "Good morning, oh my love," and those simple words spoken in the intimacy of their shared bed held more joy than she had ever imagined possible, and she smiled at him. This fearsome duke who was fearsome no longer, at least not to her, and she said, "Good morning, my heart." And they spent the morning in quiet conversation, punctuated by kisses and caresses, speaking of everything and nothing, making plans for their future, confessing small truths and large ones, and the melancholy that had haunted Beatrice for 3 seasons in London lifted completely, replaced by a bone-deep contentment and a joy so radiant that when they finally emerged from their chambers late in the afternoon, the servants who saw them could not help but smile at the transformation in both their master and their mistress, at the way the Duke's hand rested possessively at the small of his wife's back, at the way the Duchess looked up at him with such open adoration, and the entire household seemed to exhale in collective relief because love had finally found its way into the dark halls of Ravencrest, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Spring arrived at Ravencrest with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the transformation that had overtaken the estate itself, and where once the manor had stood dark and forbidding against the landscape, it now seemed to glow with an inner warmth that had nothing to do with the increased sunlight, and everything to do with the happiness that radiated from its Duke and Duchess. And Beatrice walked through gardens that she had coaxed back to life, with the help of enthusiastic groundskeepers who had been delighted to see their long-neglected plots receiving attention, and she paused by beds of roses that were just beginning to bud, touching the tender green leaves with fingers that bore a new ring Sebastian had commissioned. A band of gold, set with sapphires, the color of her eyes that he had presented to her one morning, with a confession that their wedding ring had been chosen in haste, but this one was chosen with love, and she wore both now, symbols of the journey they had travelled, from convenient arrangement to profound devotion. And Sebastian found her there among the roses, came up behind her, and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest in a gesture that had become habitual. This need to touch her, to reassure himself of her presence and her willing reception of his affection, and he pressed a kiss to the curve of her neck and asked what occupied her thoughts, and she turned in his arms to face him, and there was something in her expression that made his breath catch, a combination of joy and nervousness and anticipation that he could not quite interpret. And she took his hand and placed it against her abdomen, holding it there with both of hers, and she said, "I believe we are to have a child, Sebastian. I believe our love has created new life." And she watched as understanding dawned in his face. He watched the way his eyes widened, and then filled with tears that he did not bother to hide, and he dropped to his knees before her in the garden, pressing his face against her stomach, his arms wrapping around her hips, and he wept with a joy so pure it made her own tears fall. And they stayed like that for long moments, while the spring breeze moved through the budding roses and carried the scent of new growth and possibility. And when he finally rose, he kissed her with such tender reverence that she felt cherished beyond measure. And the news spread through the estate and then gradually to London society, and there were those who had whispered cruel things about their marriage, who now found themselves forced to acknowledge that the Duke of Ravencrest and his unlikely Duchess appeared genuinely, remarkably happy, and invitations that had once been extended out of obligation to Sebastian's title began to include genuine warmth for the couple themselves. For Beatrice's quiet kindness had won over even the most hardened society matrons, and Sebastian's reputation had softened as people observed the way he looked at his wife, the way he seemed to exist in a state of perpetual wonder that she had chosen him. And when they appeared together at events now there was no cruelty in the whispers, only speculation about whether the child would have his dark colouring or her fair features, whether it would be a boy to inherit the dukedom or a girl to be doted upon by her formidable father, and Beatrice bloomed with her pregnancy, her happiness so evident that it seemed to light her from within, and Sebastian became impossibly more protective, more attentive, reading to her in the evenings, with his hand resting on her growing belly, feeling for the first flutters of movement that would herald their child's presence, and the contentment that settled over Ravencrest was remarked upon by every visitor, by the servants who had watched their master transform from a man locked in solitary darkness to one who smiled readily and laughed often. And as summer approached and Beatrice's time drew near, Sebastian confessed that he had never imagined such happiness could exist, that he had spent so many years convinced he was meant for isolation, and she reminded him that she too had resigned herself to spinsterhood, had believed herself overlooked and unremarkable, and yet here they were, proof that even the most unlikely beginnings could lead to extraordinary joy. 5 years had passed since that spring when Beatrice had announced her pregnancy in the rose garden, and Ravencrest had transformed into something neither Sebastian nor Beatrice could have imagined in those early days of their arranged marriage, for the halls that had once echoed with silence now rang with the laughter of children, twin boys who had arrived first with their father's dark hair and their mother's gentle eyes, and then 2 years later, a daughter who possessed Sebastian's intensity but Beatrice's serene disposition. And it was this daughter, 4-year-old Caroline, who stood now in the portrait gallery at Ravencrest, her small hand clasped in her father's much larger one as she gazed up at the painting of the grandmother she had never known, and Sebastian knelt beside her as he often did, telling her stories of the woman in the portrait, and Beatrice watched them from the doorway with a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes even now, after years of such happiness, and she thought of how far they had travelled from that cold beginning, how the man who had seemed so unreachable had become the most devoted of husbands and tender of fathers, and the season had arrived again in London, and they had decided to attend for the first time in several years, not out of obligation, but because Beatrice wished to show Sebastian that she no longer feared society's judgment, that she wore her position as his Duchess with pride and confidence, and so they found themselves once more in a London ballroom, though this time they arrived not as the subject of cruel whispers, but as an established couple whose evident devotion had become something of a legend, for the story of how the fearsome Duke of Ravencrest had been transformed by love had spread through society until even those who had mocked their union now spoke of them with something approaching envy, and Beatrice wore a gown of deep sapphire that matched the ring Sebastian had given her, and he stood beside her with his hand possessively at the small of her back. That gesture that had become as natural as breathing, and they watched the young debutantes in their white gowns, watched the nervous mothers and the calculating suitors, and Beatrice felt a rush of gratitude that her own years of such anxiety had led her here, to this man, to this life. And Sebastian bent to whisper in her ear, "Do you remember the first time I saw you in a ballroom like this? You were reading in the corner, completely oblivious to the spectacle around you," and she turned to look up at him with a smile that held years of accumulated love, and replied, "I remember being certain I would never receive a proposal, that I was destined for spinsterhood," and he pulled her closer and said, "You had already received a proposal, you simply did not know it yet, for I had decided that very night that if I ever possessed the courage to offer for anyone, it would be the girl who found books more interesting than ballroom drama." And she laughed softly and reminded him that he had waited another full year before approaching her father, and he confessed that it had taken him that long to convince himself that she might possibly accept a man like him, might possibly see past his reputation and his scars, and she reached up to trace the scar on his face with gentle fingers. There in the middle of the ballroom with all of society watching, and she said, "This face is dear to me beyond measure. These scars are part of the man I love, and I would not change a single aspect of you." And he caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, and around them the ballroom seemed to fade away, and they might have been alone in their library at Ravencrest for all the attention they paid to others. And later, when they danced together as they had on that pivotal night years ago, they moved with the ease of long-time partners who knew each other's rhythms perfectly, and Beatrice thought of their children sleeping safely at the estate, thought of the life they had built together, thought of how close she had come to never knowing any of this, because she had almost given up hope, and she looked up at Sebastian to find him watching her with that expression of wonder that still appeared on his face sometimes, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune, and she knew her own face must show the same amazement, the same gratitude for the unexpected gift they had been given. And when the dance ended, they left the ballroom early, eager to return to Ravencrest, to their children, to the home they had created together. And as their carriage rolled through the London streets toward the road that would take them north, Sebastian pulled her close and said, "Thank you, Beatrice, for seeing me when I believed myself invisible, for loving me when I thought myself unlovable, for giving me a life I never dared to dream possible." And she nestled against him and replied, "Thank you, my love, for noticing a wallflower, for choosing me across 3 seasons, for showing me that the greatest love stories often have the most unlikely beginnings." And they rode through the night toward home, toward the future they would continue to build together, two people who had been overlooked and isolated, finding in each other a completeness that transformed everything. Dear listener, if you have traveled with us through this story from that rain-soaked London ballroom, where a young woman sat resigned to spinsterhood, to the happiness that now filled Ravencrest's halls, then you have witnessed a truth that bears repeating in a world that so often tells us we must be seen immediately or not at all, must be chosen quickly or resign ourselves to being overlooked forever. And the lesson that Beatrice and Sebastian's story offers is one of patience and the recognition that the deepest connections are rarely formed in an instant, but rather built slowly through accumulated moments of understanding and choice. And it teaches us that what society deems valuable and what truly matters in matters of the heart are often vastly different things. For Beatrice was dismissed as unremarkable by those who measured worth in superficial terms, and Sebastian was feared and avoided for scars both visible and invisible. Yet in each other they found a completeness that transformed not only their own lives, but the very estate that had once stood as a monument to isolation and pain. And if you find yourself in a season of waiting, if you feel yourself overlooked or dismissed, if you wonder whether anyone will ever see past the surface to the depths beneath, then let this story remind you that being overlooked by those who cannot see clearly is not a condemnation, but simply evidence that you are waiting for someone with better vision, someone who will recognize in you what others missed. And the kind of love worth having is the kind that chooses you, not despite your perceived flaws, but with full awareness of your complete humanity, the kind that grows stronger through patience rather than fading when immediate passion cools. the kind that heals old wounds and creates new possibilities, where before there seemed to be only resignation. And perhaps the greatest gift we can offer ourselves is the courage to remain open to connection, even after disappointment, to continue showing up as our authentic selves, even when it seems no one is paying attention. For Beatrice brought her books to ballrooms and refused to pretend interest in things that bored her. And it was precisely that authenticity that caught Sebastian's notice, that made her stand out in a sea of practiced performance. And Sebastian, despite his fearsome reputation, allowed Beatrice to see his vulnerability, to witness his transformation, and in that mutual vulnerability, they found a strength that sustained them through misunderstandings and doubt. And so, as we leave them in their happiness, surrounded by the family they created and the love they nurtured from the most unlikely beginning, let us carry with us the knowledge that our own stories are still being written, and that patience and authenticity and the courage to be truly seen are never wasted. And may you find rest tonight in the assurance that somewhere, perhaps in the most unexpected place, someone is learning to see you clearly, someone is being prepared to love you well, and may your heart remain open to that possibility, even as you build a life of purpose and meaning in the waiting. And may peace settle over you like spring rain over winter-hardened ground, bringing with it the promise of new growth and unexpected blooms, for the story you are living may yet surprise you with its beauty. This tale comes to you from Love and Passion Archives, and until we meet again in another story, may you rest well, dear listener. May you rest well. A. Diva.